The afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows of Los Angeles International Airport, painting the terminal in soft gold. People hurried past with suitcases, announcements echoed overhead, and the scent of coffee lingered in the air. Among the crowd sat Ethan Brooks, a calm, disciplined figure dressed in a crisp light blue shirt and khaki pants. On his wrist was a simple watch, and beside him, a small military duffel bag neatly folded. He wasn't just any passenger. He was a tomb guard, one of the few entrusted to watch over the tomb of the unknown soldier. Across the terminal, a loud voice broke the quiet rhythm. Richard Hale, a millionaire businessman, strutted through the crowd with his designer luggage rolling behind him. He wore a navy blue suit, gold watch gleaming, sunglasses perched arrogantly on his head. He spoke on his phone so loudly that everyone could hear. "First class again? They better have champagne ready. I don't mix with the economy crowd." When the boarding gate opened, passengers lined up. Ethan stood silently in line, posture straight as ever. Richard brushed past him, bumping Ethan's shoulder with a scoff. "Watch where you're going, soldier boy," he said, smirking. Ethan simply nodded. "Yes, sir. My apologies." That calm, disciplined tone irritated Richard even more. He turned to the woman behind him and whispered loudly, "Typical military type. Think they own the place because they stand still for a living." The passengers around them exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan said nothing, his eyes steady, his silence more dignified than any argument could be. As they boarded the plane, the contrast between the two men couldn't have been clearer, one defined by ego, the other by honor, one loud and boastful, the other quiet but powerful. When Richard noticed his seat assignment, right next to Ethan, he let out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, perfect," he muttered. "Just what I needed." Ethan placed his duffel under the seat, straightened his posture, and looked out the window. The engines hummed softly as the plane prepared for takeoff. What neither man knew was that this flight, and their clash of character, was about to teach everyone on board an unforgettable lesson in respect, humility, and true greatness. The plane's engines roared to life, humming beneath the floor as the cabin lights dimmed. Ethan Brooks sat calmly by the window, his back straight, eyes on the horizon. Beside him, Richard Hale lounged in his aisle seat, adjusting his gold watch and muttering impatiently as the flight attendants moved down the aisle. "Unbelievable," Richard grumbled. "These seats should be wider. I paid enough for them." Ethan offered a polite nod but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than confrontation. As the plane lifted through the clouds, passengers settled in. A soft murmur of conversation filled the cabin. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating Ethan's face, calm and focused. Richard, on the other hand, was already the loudest person on board. He tapped on his phone, showing off photos of luxury cars to the man across the aisle. "You see that Ferrari? Limited edition. Cost more than most people's houses," he bragged. The other passenger nodded awkwardly, trying to be polite. Richard turned toward Ethan, smirking. "So, soldier, what do you do when you're not polishing boots?" Ethan looked at him, tone steady and respectful. "I serve at Arlington, sir. I'm part of the guard that watches over the tomb of the unknown soldier." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Ah, so you're one of those guys who just stands there all day, doing nothing. Must be boring work." A woman sitting behind them frowned, whispering to her husband. Even the flight attendant, Sophie, paused mid-aisle, glancing toward the exchange. Ethan didn't reply. He simply folded his hands, his expression composed. The same stoicism that came from hours of silent duty, no matter the weather, no matter who was watching. Richard scoffed again. "You must think that's impressive or something. I deal with real power, money, influence, control. That's what makes the world move, not standing guard for some old statue." The air around them seemed to tighten. A few passengers shot Richard looks of disbelief. Others simply pulled out their phones, quietly recording. Sophie leaned in gently. "Sir, can I get you something to drink?" "Yes," Richard snapped. "Champagne, and then make it cold." She turned to Ethan with a soft smile. "And for you, sir?" "Just water, thank you," Ethan said, his voice calm and grounded. Richard rolled his eyes. "Of course. Water for the soldier, always keeping it simple." The plane glided smoothly through the sky, the sun now dipping toward the horizon, painting the cabin in a soft amber glow. Outside the window, clouds rolled like mountains. Inside, tension simmered. Ethan looked down at his wrist where a small insignia pin was fixed to his watch strap, the mark of the tomb guard. It wasn't made of gold or diamonds, but it meant more than any fortune. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. He'd been trained to ignore distraction, to rise above disrespect, but the sting of arrogance still lingered in the air like smoke. Then Richard leaned back and laughed loudly, almost to himself. "Tell me, soldier, does anyone even thank you for standing out there all day? Or do people just walk past and forget you exist?" Ethan turned his gaze out the window again. "We don't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "We do it so that others don't have to forget." The words hung in the air like a quiet thunderclap. For a moment, Richard said nothing. Even the passengers nearby looked up from their seats, sensing the gravity behind Ethan's calm voice. But pride doesn't let go easily. Richard forced a laugh. "Well, that's noble, I guess. Still doesn't pay the bills." Sophie, walking past again, hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "It's not about the money, sir. It's about the honor." Richard waved her off dismissively, grabbing his champagne glass. "Honor doesn't buy you a penthouse," he muttered. The flight continued, quiet except for the hum of engines and the occasional clinking of glasses. Outside, the sky deepened into twilight, streaks of orange fading into indigo. Inside, two worlds sat side by side, one built on ego, the other on duty. Have you ever met someone who judged another person without knowing their story? Drop a comment below and tell me which country and city you're watching from right now. As the comment section floods with answers from across the world, New York, London, Manila, Toronto, Sydney, the story builds toward a confrontation no one on that flight will ever forget. The calm before the storm had arrived, and when the turbulence hit, it wouldn't just shake the plane. It would shake Richard's entire view of what it truly means to have honor. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour. Dinner trays were being collected and the cabin lights dimmed for the long flight ahead. Outside, the clouds looked like silver waves under the moonlight. Inside, one conversation was about to explode into something unforgettable. Richard Hale, the millionaire businessman, had just finished another glass of champagne. His words were starting to slur, but his arrogance had only grown louder. He turned toward Ethan, grinning with a self-satisfied smirk. "So tell me, soldier boy," he sneered, "how much do you even make standing out there all day? A few hundred a week? Maybe a free lunch from Uncle Sam?" Ethan didn't answer. He looked straight ahead, keeping his posture calm, the same unshakable stance he maintained every hour he guarded the tomb of the unknown soldier. Richard chuckled louder. "Oh, come on, don't be shy. You're sitting next to a man who's made millions in the time it takes you to salute." A few passengers looked up from their seats, their eyes narrowing. Sophie, the flight attendant, walked by again, subtly watching the interaction. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but his tone remained steady. "I'm honored to serve my country, sir. That's enough for me." Richard burst out laughing. "Enough? You call that enough? You're wasting your life for a job that nobody even notices." The man across the aisle, who'd been silent the whole time, leaned forward. "Hey, buddy," he said, "maybe you should show a little respect. You don't even know who you're talking to." Richard smirked. "Respect? He's not a general or a politician. He's a guard, a statue in uniform." Ethan turned his head slowly, eyes calm but piercing. "Every soldier represents something larger than themselves," he said softly. "We stand for those who can't stand anymore." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. The man across the aisle nodded in admiration. But Richard wasn't done. His pride wouldn't let him stop. He laughed mockingly. "So what do you do when it rains? Just stand there and pretend you're made of stone? I bet people just walk past and ignore you, like some tourist attraction." Ethan finally looked him in the eye. "We stand there, sir, no matter the weather, no matter the hour. Because someone's son, someone's father, lies beneath that tomb. And their sacrifice deserves our silence and not the world's applause." The cabin fell silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed distant for a moment, but Richard, red-faced and restless, couldn't bear the quiet. "You sound like a robot," he said bitterly, "always following orders. No freedom, no success, no individuality." Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. "Freedom is exactly what I protect. And success, sir, is measured by what you give, not what you take." That line hit harder than turbulence. The woman 2 rows back whispered, "Wow," and another passenger quietly clapped once before stopping, unsure if it was appropriate. Richard noticed the shifting energy and panicked. He wasn't used to losing control, and especially not in public. His tone grew louder, desperate to reclaim dominance. "Listen here," he barked. "You don't know what real pressure is. I've closed billion-dollar deals. I've built empires. You wouldn't last a day in my shoes." Ethan turned slightly toward him, his expression calm and unshaken. "Maybe not," he said, "but I've stood in the rain, unmoving as thunder cracked above me, because beneath my feet lies a soldier who never got to see his family again. That's not pressure, Mr. Hale, that's honor." Every word carried weight. Every syllable silenced the arrogance in the air. Richard froze for a moment, his champagne glass trembling slightly in his hand. He looked around. Faces were watching him, eyes filled with quiet judgment. He wasn't the center of admiration anymore. He was the example of ignorance. Sophie approached, speaking gently. "Sir, maybe it's time to get some rest." But Richard waved her off, muttering, "No one talks to me like that." He leaned closer to Ethan, his voice dripping with venom. "You think people like you matter? You're just background noise in a world run by people like me." Ethan looked him straight in the eye and said softly, "Then maybe, sir, it's time the world started listening to the quiet ones." The plane shook slightly, a brief moment of turbulence, as if the skies themselves echoed Ethan's words. Passengers gripped their armrests. Some smiled. One older veteran in the back even raised his hand slightly in salute. The mood had shifted completely. Richard wasn't the loudest man on the plane anymore. He was the loneliest. Ethan leaned back, resting his head against the seat, closing his eyes. The confrontation was over for him. But for Richard, it was just beginning. The guilt crept in slowly, twisting in his chest. His own words replayed in his mind, sounding uglier each time. Outside, the moonlight reflected off the plane's wings. Silver, silent, steady. Just like the guard sitting beside him. If you were sitting on that flight watching this unfold, what would you have done? Would you have stepped in or stayed quiet? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm reading everyone. As the comments roll in from around the world, I'd speak up. Respect for the guard. This made me emotional. One thing becomes clear. Respect can't be bought. It's earned through integrity, sacrifice, and silence when others shout. And soon Richard Hale was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The silence in the cabin hung heavy, thick enough to drown out even the soft hum of the engines. Richard sat stiffly, his glass of champagne untouched, eyes darting around as if looking for someone to agree with him. No one did. Ethan remained composed, staring out the window at the endless stretch of clouds below. His calmness wasn't weakness, and it was command, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Across the aisle, a man in his late 60s leaned forward. His voice was quiet but carried authority. "Excuse me," he said to Richard. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" Richard frowned. "Yeah, some kind of soldier, right?" The older man shook his head slowly. "Not just a soldier, son. That man right there is part of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard. He's a tomb guard at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most elite and disciplined units in the entire military." Murmurs spread across the rows. A young woman gasped quietly. Someone whispered, "Wait, the tomb of the unknown soldier?" That's sacred ground. Ethan didn't turn around. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. The old man continued, his tone respectful. "These men stand watch every hour of every day, in rain, snow, or blazing sun. They don't flinch, they don't speak, and they never, ever disrespect the mission. Their dedication honors every unidentified hero who gave their life for this country." The cabin grew even quieter. Even the flight attendants paused their service to listen. Richard blinked rapidly, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't know that," he stammered. The older man gave a faint, disappointed smile. "That's the problem. Most people don't. But he does his duty even for those who mock him." Ethan finally turned his head, his calm brown eyes meeting Richard's. "There's nothing to prove, sir," he said gently. "Respect isn't demanded. It's shown." That line hit like a wave across the cabin. A young boy in the back whispered to his father, "Dad, that's like a real hero, right?" His father nodded silently. Richard sank back into his seat, his earlier arrogance now replaced by shame. His face turned pale as realization set in. He had mocked a man who spent his life guarding the memory of heroes. The businessman's world of money and privilege suddenly felt small, hollow. All his millions couldn't buy the kind of honor sitting right next to him. One of the passengers, a woman wearing a navy jacket, spoke up softly. "My brother's buried in Arlington," she said. "Men like him make sure his memory never fades." Ethan nodded respectfully. "We never forget, ma'am. That's a promise." Her eyes filled with tears. She placed a hand over her heart. "Thank you." The flight attendant, Sophie, appeared again, this time with a small smile. "Mr. Hale," she said gently, "perhaps you'd like some water?" Richard nodded silently, unable to meet anyone's gaze. He took the glass, hands trembling slightly. The atmosphere had completely transformed. The same people who once stared awkwardly now looked at Ethan with deep admiration. A few passengers subtly recorded the moment, not for drama, but because they wanted to remember what true composure looked like. The older man leaned back in his seat, whispering to the person next to him, "They don't make men like that often anymore." Ethan simply adjusted his seatbelt and closed his eyes. For him, this wasn't a victory. It wasn't revenge. It was just another test of patience. Another reminder that respect is best taught through example, not argument. Outside the window, the sunrise began to peek over the horizon, streaks of orange and gold painting the clouds. It was a quiet symbol of dignity after darkness. Richard glanced at the window too, the reflection of his own face looking back at him. But this time, it looked smaller, weaker, humbled. He swallowed hard, whispering almost to himself, "I'm sorry." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. Some lessons are best learned in silence. And for Richard Hale, the man who thought money could buy status, this flight had just become the most expensive lesson of his life. The aircraft hummed steadily as it cut through the clouds, but inside, the silence between Richard Hale and Ethan Brooks was louder than the engines. Passengers were still processing what had just happened. The businessman who mocked a soldier had unknowingly insulted a man of sacred duty, a tomb guard who had given his life to honor those who gave theirs. Richard shifted in his seat, restless, guilt gnawing at his chest. Every time he glanced toward Ethan, he felt smaller, as if his wealth, his status, and his expensive suit meant nothing. And for the first time in a long time, he was right. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Listen," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "about earlier. Shouldn't have said those things." Ethan didn't look up from the small notebook he was reading. "It's all right, sir," he said calmly. But Richard couldn't let it go that easily. "No, it's not," he insisted. "I was rude, ignorant. I thought you were just some—" He stopped himself, embarrassed. "I didn't know who you were." Ethan turned his head, his gaze steady but kind. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." That line landed like a weight in Richard's chest. He looked away, eyes tracing the curve of the window. The truth stung because it was simple and undeniable. A few minutes passed in silence. The seatbelt sign turned off and the aisle filled with quiet movement. A flight attendant brought coffee for Ethan. Richard ordered the same, maybe hoping it'd help him feel less out of place. After a sip, he tried again. "You know," Richard said, forcing a chuckle. "I've met presidents, CEOs, generals, but I've never felt this, small before." Ethan smiled faintly. "Humility is rare, sir. It usually arrives when it's most needed." Richard nodded, staring into his cup. "I've built companies from scratch, employed hundreds of people. But none of that feels like it matters right now. You do something that actually means something." Ethan shook his head slightly. "Everyone serves in their own way. Mine just happens to be visible." For a moment, both men sat in silence again. Two opposite worlds finding common ground in quiet understanding. But fate wasn't done testing Richard yet. Half an hour later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a minor medical situation. If there's any trained personnel or medical professionals on board, please notify the cabin crew immediately." The cabin stirred with nervous murmurs. A few rows ahead, an elderly woman had fainted. A flight attendant rushed to her side, calling for assistance. Ethan stood up instantly, calm and composed. He wasn't a doctor, but years of training had made him excellent in emergencies. "I'm trained in CPR and first aid," he said to the crew. Please, the attendant said gratefully. We could use your help. Ethan knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse, tilting her chin, and assessing her breathing. His movements were precise, focused, unwavering, the same discipline that had defined his service. Richard froze, watching in awe. Around him, passengers whispered words like hero, professional, and calm. Within minutes, Ethan stabilized the woman with the flight attendant's help. They covered her with a blanket, placed an oxygen mask on her, and waited for the plane to divert for medical assistance. When Ethan returned to his seat, passengers quietly applauded. Not a loud, chaotic clap, but a respectful one. Richard turned to him, eyes wide. You didn't even hesitate, Ethan smiled. When someone needs help, hesitation can cost lives. Richard leaned back, speechless. He had spent his life chasing power, money, and recognition, but what he had just witnessed was something those things could never buy: duty without expectation. The elderly woman's husband came over, trembling with gratitude. Thank you, son. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. Ethan simply replied, It's what any of us would do, sir. But everyone in the cabin knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would act that way. As the hours passed, the plane grew quiet again. The passengers were no longer strangers. They shared a silent respect for the man who had changed the atmosphere of an entire flight. Richard sat deep in thought. Finally, he spoke softly. I've spent my life thinking that success was about being better than others. But today I realized true success is about being better for others. Ethan nodded, still looking out the window. That's a good start. Richard chuckled faintly. You know, I make speeches at corporate events all the time. But what you said in a few words, and that'll stick with me for the rest of my life. As the plane began its descent, the captain announced, Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. Ethan tucked away his small notebook, preparing to disembark. Richard glanced at him, hesitant. Hey, when we land, would you allow me to buy you dinner sometime? As a proper apology. Ethan smiled politely. I appreciate the offer, sir. But my duty doesn't stop when the flight ends. Richard nodded, understanding. This wasn't a man you could repay with a meal. This was a man who didn't act for reward. He lived by principle. As the wheels touched down, a soft cheer rippled through the cabin. The elderly woman was safe, the flight had gone smoothly, and everyone, especially Richard, had learned something profound. When the plane taxied to the gate, Ethan stood, grabbed his duffel bag, and turned to Richard one last time. Take care, sir, he said with quiet respect. Richard stood too, extending his hand. No, thank you, for reminding me what respect really means. Ethan shook his hand firmly, nodded once, and walked down the aisle. His back was straight, his steps confident. Not prideful, but purposeful. Passengers turned their heads to watch him leave. Some saluted quietly. Others simply smiled. Richard remained standing long after Ethan disappeared through the terminal doors. His world felt different now. Not smaller, but clearer. For the first time, he realized that the measure of a man isn't found in what's in his bank account. It's found in what's in his heart. The aircraft's wheels screeched softly against the tarmac, signaling the end of a journey that had changed far more than anyone expected. The flight attendants thanked the passengers, but the usual rustle of movement was missing. People seemed reflective, quiet, humbled. Richard sat motionless, eyes fixed on the soldier beside him. Ethan Brooks, and the man he had mocked, was now the very image of integrity and grace. Every word, every action, every quiet breath radiated a kind of respect that couldn't be bought or taught. When the doors finally opened, the soft voice of the captain echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed safely. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to thank one of our passengers, Sergeant Ethan Brooks of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, for his quick action and service today. It's an honor to have you aboard. The cabin erupted in applause. It wasn't the loud, casual kind you hear after landing. This one was full of emotion. People clapped with tears in their eyes. Ethan stood, quietly shaking his head, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Just doing my duty, he said softly. But it was too late. The world was about to find out who he truly was. As passengers exited, they found a small group of airport security personnel waiting. A Among them stood a tall man in uniform, a colonel. His presence immediately drew attention. He stepped forward as Ethan approached. "Sergeant Brooks," he said with firm respect, "you're a hard man to track down. The general's been trying to reach you." Ethan blinked, slightly surprised. "Sir?" The colonel smiled faintly. "Word travels fast. That medical situation you handled on the flight? The passenger's son works for the Defense Department. He called in, said a tomb guard just saved his mother's life mid-air." A few passengers gasped. Cameras began flashing as nearby travelers realized what was happening. The colonel continued, his tone proud but professional. "The general himself wanted to thank you personally. He's here." And just like that, from the far end of the terminal, a group of military officers entered, led by a 4-star general. The sight made everyone stand still. Even the airport staff instinctively straightened their posture. Richard felt a chill down his spine. He'd seen generals on TV at charity events, but seeing one walk toward Ethan was a different kind of power entirely. The general approached, removing his cap and extending his hand. "Sergeant Brooks," he said, his voice deep and full of respect. "It's not often we get to publicly acknowledge the men who serve quietly. But today, you've reminded the world what real service looks like." Ethan shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my part," the general smiled. "That humility is why you wear that badge, soldier." He turned to the surrounding passengers. "For those who don't know, this man is one of the select few who guard the tomb of the unknown soldier. He represents every fallen hero who was never named. Rain or shine, 24 hours a day, he stands watch. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't complain. He doesn't stop." The crowd fell silent. Tears welled in a few eyes. A young girl clutched her mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, he's like a real-life superhero." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to apologize again, but the words refused to come out. The general turned toward him. "You must be Mr. Hale, correct?" Richard froze. "Yes, sir. I heard you had an interesting flight." The words weren't scolding, they were measured. The general studied him for a moment, then said, "Consider yourself lucky, son. Not everyone gets to learn humility from a man like Sergeant Brooks." Richard nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I understand that now." Ethan placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, easing the tension. "Sir, no harm done. We all learn in our own time." That one sentence, calm, forgiving, dignified, hit harder than any punishment ever could. The general smiled at Ethan again. "The department will be issuing a commendation for your actions today. You saved a life and upheld the highest standards of service. I'll see to it personally." Ethan nodded humbly. "Thank you, sir. But honestly, I'd prefer it stay quiet. The tomb isn't about me." The general paused, clearly moved. "And that's exactly why you deserve recognition." Someone in the crowd, maybe one of the passengers, whispered, "That man's a hero." Another voice added, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear uniforms." The murmurs grew until the entire terminal seemed to echo with quiet admiration. Have you ever met someone whose humility inspired you? Tell us in the comments, and let us know which country and city you're watching from. As the officers escorted Ethan toward a waiting vehicle, Richard followed at a respectful distance. He couldn't let this moment pass without saying what needed to be said. "Sergeant Brooks," he called out. Ethan turned, smiling slightly. Richard took a deep breath. "You changed something in me today. I don't know if I can ever repay that." Ethan extended his hand once more. "Just live with respect, sir." "That's repayment enough." Richard shook his hand tightly, and for the first time his handshake wasn't a show of power. It was gratitude. As Ethan walked away with the general, the sunlight streaming through the airport windows seemed to follow him, reflecting off his uniform, glowing faintly against the polished floor. Passengers stood silently, watching him disappear through the doors. Each one changed in some small way. Richard turned to look at his own reflection in the glass, his expensive suit, his luxury watch. None of it impressed him anymore. He exhaled slowly and muttered, "Respect isn't given to power. It's earned by character." He walked toward the exit carrying his bag, but this time not with arrogance, with humility. Behind him, whispers lingered through the terminal. "That's the soldier from the plane. Did you see how calm he was? He didn't even ask for thanks." And somewhere beyond the glass, Ethan Brooks climbed into the military vehicle, expression steady, gaze forward. For him, it was just another day, Another silent act of duty that would never make the headlines but would live forever in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The tomb guard didn't need fame. He already carried honor. By the time Ethan Brooks reached his quarters that night, his phone was buzzing nonstop. He didn't understand why at first. He didn't use social media much, rarely even turned his phone on except to check messages from his unit. But tonight his notifications wouldn't stop. He opened one of them, a video thumbnail from inside the airplane. The title read, "Millionaire Humiliates Soldier on Flight." But watch what happens next. The video already had over 2 million views. Ethan frowned, unsure what to think. He tapped play. There he was, calmly sitting in his seat while Richard Hale mocked him, laughed at his uniform, made a fool of himself in front of dozens of passengers. Then came the turning point, the medical emergency, the calm professionalism, the applause, and finally the salute from the captain. The comments flooded in below. That soldier handled it like a true gentleman. Some people wear money, others wear honor. I cried watching this. The world needs more people like him. Ethan sighed. He never wanted attention, only respect for the values he stood for. By morning, the video had exploded across every platform: TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. It was everywhere. Clips of Ethan helping the elderly woman mid-air, the captain announcing his name, the general shaking his hand. News anchors replayed the footage, voices filled with awe. Today, America is talking about humility, respect, and one man's quiet strength. Ethan Brooks had become a symbol of dignity overnight. Meanwhile, Richard Hale, once celebrated for his wealth and luxury, was facing a storm. His name trended for all the wrong reasons. Ethan Brooks, my tomb guard, respect over riches, humbled on flight. People weren't cruel, but they were clear. They saw Ethan's calmness as strength. They saw Richard's arrogance as weakness. 2 days later, a news crew caught up with Richard outside his corporate headquarters. He looked different. The usual confident posture was gone, his tone softer. "I made a mistake," he said plainly. "I disrespected a man who represents everything I should have valued: service, humility, honor." What Sergeant Brooks did that day showed me that character isn't measured by money, but by how you treat others. The clip spread nearly as fast as the original video. People could see he was sincere. And later that evening, something happened that stunned everyone watching. At Arlington National Cemetery, under a sky painted orange by the setting sun, a quiet ceremony was taking place. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood as solemn and majestic as ever, guarded with the same discipline Ethan had upheld for years. But this time, there was an audience. Civilians, veterans, journalists, all gathered silently to honor the tomb guard who had reminded the nation what true respect meant. The general who'd met Ethan at the airport approached the podium. "Today," he said, "we honor Sergeant Ethan Brooks, not for what went viral, but for what has always been true. He represents every soldier who stands in silence for those who cannot speak. He teaches us that humility is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength." Applause rippled gently across the field. Ethan stood tall in full uniform, eyes forward, hands steady. He didn't bask in the attention. He didn't smile for the cameras. He simply nodded as if saluting the very values he lived by. Then, unexpectedly, someone stepped forward from the crowd. "Richard Hale," the audience murmured. Even Ethan blinked, surprised. Richard approached the podium with visible nervousness. "Permission to speak, sir?" he asked the general. The general nodded. Richard turned toward Ethan. "Sergeant Brooks, I'm here to say thank you, publicly. You taught me something no amount of wealth could buy: respect. I humiliated you in front of strangers and you responded with grace. You didn't lecture me, you didn't fight back, and you simply showed me what true character looks like." He paused, voice trembling slightly. "I was blind to the kind of man you are. But today I'm honored to stand here not as a businessman, but as a man learning from another." Then, in a moment that would circle the globe, Richard Hale, billionaire, CEO, and social icon, stepped forward and saluted Ethan Brooks. The crowd gasped. Cameras clicked. Tears flowed freely. Ethan, humbled but resolute, returned the salute, not out of pride, out of respect. If you believe respect has no price, comment the word honor below and tell us what true strength means to you. Within hours, clips of that salute flooded social media again. But this time it wasn't about humiliation. It was about forgiveness. Headlines everywhere read, "Millionaire redeemed by tomb guard's grace." The salute seen around the world. How one soldier reminded us what honor looks like. People from across the globe, from the US to the UK, Pakistan to Japan, posted messages of admiration. Veterans groups praised Ethan's quiet example. Parents showed the clip to their children. Schools discussed it during assemblies. And at the heart of it all, Ethan stayed the same, quiet, grounded, steadfast. One reporter managed to ask him afterward, "Sergeant Brooks, how does it feel to be an inspiration to millions?" Ethan smiled faintly. "If people remember the tomb, not me, that's enough." Weeks later, Richard sat on another flight, first class again, but this time humbler. No fancy jewelry, no arrogant talk. He looked out the window at the clouds and noticed a soldier boarding in uniform. Without hesitation, Richard stood, offered his seat, and said, "Sir, please take this. You've earned it more than I have." The soldier smiled, surprised. "Thank you." As Richard sat down in a regular aisle seat, he felt lighter, as if he'd finally understood the meaning of service before self. He glanced at his phone screen, the video of that day still pinned at the top of his social feed. Below it, the top comment read, "True power isn't in status, it's in humility." Richard smiled softly. For the first time in his life, he completely agreed. Months had passed since that unforgettable day on the flight. The day a tomb guard's humility turned a moment of humiliation into a lesson for the world. Life had returned to a quiet rhythm for Sergeant Ethan Brooks, though nothing was quite the same. Wherever he went, people recognized him, children waved, veterans saluted, and strangers thanked him for reminding them what honor looks like. But Ethan never saw himself as a hero. He still woke before dawn, still pressed his uniform until every crease was perfect, still stood guard at the tomb, rain, shine, or snow. To him, nothing had changed, but to the world, everything had. The story of the millionaire and the tomb guard had reached every corner of the globe. In schools across America, teachers shared the video as part of lessons about humility. In the Philippines, where Manny Pacquiao once inspired millions with dignity and grace, posters of Ethan stood alongside quotes about respect and service. Even in London, a monument near Westminster displayed his image beneath a single line, "True honor stands silently." Ethan never asked for fame, but his story had become something bigger, a movement, a reminder that uniforms don't define power, character does. As for Richard Hale, life looked very different now. He stepped away from his company for a while, not out of shame, but reflection. He sold one of his private jets and used the money to start a scholarship fund for veterans' children, naming it after Ethan's fallen comrades. He visited Arlington quietly one afternoon. No cameras, no media, just a bouquet of white lilies in his hand. He placed them near the tomb, bowed his head and whispered, "Thank you for showing me what I couldn't see." That moment wasn't filmed, but it didn't need to be. It was real, and that's what mattered most. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the flight, a ceremony was held at Arlington. Ethan was there, standing tall in his full ceremonial uniform, the same precision, the same silence. As the event concluded, Richard arrived, dressed simply, not like a billionaire, but like a man who had changed. The crowd murmured as he approached Ethan. No microphones, no grand speech, just two men who had walked through humiliation, pride, forgiveness, and found respect. Richard extended his hand. Ethan took it firmly, still standing tall. "Sergeant," Richard said softly. "Always will," Ethan replied. They exchanged a quiet smile, one that said everything words couldn't. If this story moved you, comment "Honor lives on" below, and tell us what you think true respect means today. Later that evening, Ethan sat on his porch watching the sun sink behind the hills. The air was calm, and the flag outside his home fluttered gently in the wind. He thought about the strange chain of events that started with an insult at 30,000 feet, an insult that turned into inspiration, a moment of arrogance that gave birth to awareness. He didn't think of himself as a symbol, just a man who stood for something simple, something eternal. Duty, respect, and humility. Inside his home, a small envelope sat on the table. It was from Richard. Inside was a note. I once thought power came from wealth. Now I know it comes from honor. Thank you for teaching me that. Ethan smiled faintly and placed the note beside a framed photograph of his fallen brothers. The screen fades to black and then slowly brightens to show the tomb of the unknown. Soldier, a single tomb guard marches, silent, steady, unbroken. The caption appears, "For every soldier who stands in silence, the world salutes you." A soft orchestral theme plays, strings and horns, emotional but uplifting. As the final frame fades, one line appears on screen. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned. Then Ethan's salute, firm, proud, eternal, freezes mid-motion. If you believe humility is stronger than pride, hit like, type honor in the comments, and share this story so the world never forgets what respect truly means.